October 1947. A cold, relentless rain was washing the sins of New York City into the gutters of Lenox Avenue, but inside Small's paradise, the world was on fire. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of stale tobacco, expensive bay rum, and the intoxicating brassy heat of a 10-piece jazz band blowing their souls out onto the stage. The dimly lit sanctuary was packed shoulder to shoulder, men in sharp, wide-lapelled suits, and women draped in silk and sequins sat at the small, candlelit tables, completely entranced by the woman standing in the spotlight. Her name was Lorraine Parker. When Lorraine sang, the clinking of ice in highball glasses stopped. The hushed conversations in the corner booths died away. She didn't just sing the blues, she lived them, pouring a smooth velvet melody over the crowd that made the harsh reality of living in a segregated city fade away, if only for an hour. She wore a floor-length gown of deep emerald green, her hair perfectly styled, her posture radiating an effortless, untouchable dignity. In this room, in this neighborhood, she was royalty. But just beyond the heavy oak doors of the club, the real world was waiting. And the real world didn't care about the dignity of a black woman in Harlem, no matter how beautifully she could sing. Standing near the coat check, nursing a cup of black coffee he had forced the bartender to give him for free, was Officer Raymond Hayes. Hayes was a heavy-set man with a thick neck, a cruel, sloping jaw, and eyes the color of dirty ice. The brass buttons of his New York Police Department uniform caught the dim light, a stark reminder of the power he carried. To the city of New York, he was an officer of the law, a sworn protector of the peace. But to the residents of Harlem, Raymond Hayes was a predator. He didn't view his beat as a neighborhood to protect. He viewed it as a hunting ground. He viewed the people who lived there not as citizens, but as prey. Hayes watched Lorraine on the stage, his eyes tracking her every movement with a cold, terrifying hunger. He didn't hear the music. He didn't feel the soul of the room. He only saw something beautiful that he believed. By virtue of his badge and the color of his skin, he had a right to break. At 1 a.m, the final set ended. The crowd began to filter out into the wet, freezing night, laughing and pulling their overcoats tight against the chill. Lorraine retreated to her small dressing room near the back alley exit. She was exhausted, her feet aching in her heels, but she felt the lingering warmth of the applause. She carefully removed her stage makeup, draped a heavy wool coat over her shoulders, and picked up her purse. She just wanted to go home, lock her door, and sleep. She stepped out of the back door of Small's paradise into the narrow, claustrophobic alleyway. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, and the only light came from a single, flickering street lamp at the far end of the brick corridor. The alley smelled of damp garbage, wet ash, and decaying brick. Lorraine took 3 steps toward the street before a massive shadow detached itself from the recess of a bricked-up doorway. "Going somewhere in a hurry, Songbird?" The voice was rough, slurred with the unmistakable edge of cheap whiskey. Lorraine froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She recognized the voice. Every woman who worked the late shift in Harlem knew to fear that voice. Officer Hayes stepped into the faint pool of light. He was smiling, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a trap snapping shut. "Officer Hayes," Lorraine said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She stood perfectly straight, clutching her purse to her chest. "My shift is over. I'm going home." "It's late," Hayes said, taking a slow, heavy step toward her. The sound of his thick-soled police boots splashing in the puddles echoed off the narrow brick walls. Dangerous neighborhood for a pretty girl to be walking all by herself. Lots of criminals out here. You should let me conduct a routine inspection. Make sure you're safe. I am perfectly safe, officer. Please let me pass. She tried to step around him, keeping a wide berth, her eyes fixed on the glow of the street lamp at the end of the alley. The light seemed a million miles away. Hayes moved with a speed that defied his heavy frame. He lunged, his massive, meaty hand clamping down on her forearm with the crushing force of a vice. Lorraine gasped, the pain shooting up to her shoulder. I said, I'm conducting an inspection, Hayes hissed, his whiskey-soaked breath washing over her face. The mask of the law enforcement officer melted away entirely, revealing the pure, unadulterated monster beneath. He shoved her backward. Her spine slammed against the wet, freezing brick of the alley wall, knocking the wind out of her lungs. Her purse hit the cobblestones, spilling her lipstick, her keys, and her hard-earned tips into the muddy water. She opened her mouth to scream, to call for the bouncers inside the club, but Hayes slammed his forearm against her throat, pinning her to the wall, cutting off her air. You scream, Hayes whispered, his eyes wide and wild, and I'll arrest you for assaulting an officer. I'll drag you down to the precinct, throw you in a cell with the drunks, and tell the judge you came at me with a knife. Who do you think they're going to believe, Songbird? A decorated cop or a colored girl from a gin joint? The terror that washed over Lorraine was absolute. It was a suffocating, paralyzing dread. She realized in that dark, wet alley that she was completely cut off from the world of justice. The man pinning her to the wall was the law. There was no one to call. There was no one coming to save her. What happened next in the shadows of that alley was a shattering of peace, a violent, humiliating assault designed not just to physically harm, but to completely destroy the spirit of the woman who endured it. Hayes used his weight, his authority, and his absolute certainty that he was untouchable. When he was finally finished, he adjusted his uniform, smoothed his tie, and looked down at Lorraine, who was slumped against the wet bricks, weeping silently, her beautiful coat torn and stained with the grime of the city. Have a good night, Miss Parker, Hayes sneered, casually stepping over her spilled purse. Keep singing those pretty songs. He turned and walked out of the alley, whistling a tuneless melody, leaving her broken in the dark. For a long time, Lorraine couldn't move. The cold seeped into her bones. The physical pain was sharp and agonizing, but the psychological devastation was a bottomless abyss. She knew the rules of the city. If she went to the police precinct to report what had happened, she would be laughed out of the building. Or worse, they would brand her a liar, a troublemaker, and they would make sure she never worked, never sang, and never lived in peace again. But Lorraine Parker was a survivor. Slowly, agonizingly, she pulled herself up from the wet cobblestones. She gathered her ruined coat around her shoulders. She didn't walk toward the police station. She walked deeper into Harlem. She walked until she reached a brownstone on 125th Street, climbing the steps with the last ounce of strength she possessed, and knocked on the heavy wooden door. The door opened, revealing Illinois Gordon. Illinois was a man who knew the streets better than he knew the lines on his own palms. He was a hustler, a businessman, and a man who lived his life navigating the dangerous currents of the Harlem underworld. But more importantly, he was a friend. He took one look at Lorraine, at her bruised face, her torn clothes, the hollow, shattered look in her normally vibrant eyes, and the breath left his lungs. Lorraine, Illinois whispered, reaching out to pull her out of the cold. "Lord Almighty, Cat, what happened to you?" She collapsed into his arms, the dam finally breaking, the sobs racking her body. She couldn't speak the words, but she didn't have to. Illinois gently guided her to his sofa, wrapped her in a thick wool blanket, and poured her a glass of neat brandy. He sat beside her, his jaw clenching so tight his teeth threatened to crack. He listened as she forced the story out, her voice trembling, choking on the tears and the shame. When she spoke the name Raymond Hayes, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Illinois stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the rain-slicked streets. His blood was boiling. A hot, blinding rage threatened to consume him. His first instinct, the instinct of the street, was to grab his revolver, track Hayes down, and empty every chamber into the uniform. But Illinois was not a fool. He knew that the streets of Harlem were a chessboard, and if you moved the wrong piece out of anger, the entire board would catch fire. "You stay here," Lorraine Illinois said, his voice low and tight. "You lock this door. You don't answer it for anyone but me." "Illinois, please," she begged, clutching the blanket. "Don't do anything crazy. He's a cop. They'll kill you." "I'm not going to do anything crazy," Illinois said, pulling his fedora low over his eyes. "I'm going to see the king." 10 blocks away, in a sprawling, immaculate apartment in the Lenox Terrace, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in his favorite leather armchair. The apartment was a fortress of elegance and calm. Soft, classical music drifted from the phonograph in the corner. The air smelled of expensive Cuban tobacco and the faint, sweet perfume of his wife, Mamie, who was asleep in the master bedroom. Bumpy sat perfectly still, a heavy crystal glass of scotch resting on the side table, his eyes focused entirely on the chessboard in front of him. He was playing against himself, studying the board, analyzing the angles, calculating moves 10 steps in advance. To the outside world, Bumpy Johnson was a gangster, the undisputed boss of the Harlem numbers racket. But to the people who knew him, he was a philosopher king, a man of terrifying intellect and unshakable composure. He didn't rule with senseless violence, he ruled with precision. He understood power better than the politicians downtown, and he understood human nature better than the psychiatrists in their high-rise offices. A sharp, rhythmic knock broke the tranquility of the room. 3 heavy raps. The code. Bumpy didn't jump. He didn't reach for the weapon he kept in the drawer of his desk. He simply looked up from the chessboard and said, "Enter." Illinois Gordon walked in. He didn't bother taking off his wet hat. He didn't bother offering a pleasant greeting. He walked straight to the center of the Persian rug and stood there, water dripping from his overcoat, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Bumpy took one look at his friend's eyes and knew that the peace of the evening was over. "Pour yourself a drink, Illinois," Bumpy said quietly, picking up a black knight and holding it between his fingers. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I haven't seen a ghost, Bumpy, but I'm about to make one," Illinois said, his voice shaking with rage. Illinois didn't sit. He paced the room, his words spilling out in a rush, detailing the horrors of what had happened in the alley behind Small's Paradise. He told Bumpy about Lorraine. He told him about the torn dress, the bruises, the terror. And finally, he spoke the name. It was Hayes. Officer Raymond Hayes. Bumpy Johnson did not shout. He didn't curse. He didn't throw his glass against the wall. He sat perfectly still, the black knight resting lightly in his palm. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. The classical music on the phonograph seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. Inside, Bumpy's mind was racing, running through 1,000 different scenarios, 1,000 different calculations. The boys on the corner are already whispering. Illinois pushed, leaning over the chessboard, his hands planted flat on the table. Word is spreading. If we don't handle this, Bumpy, if we let a blue uniform walk into our house and treat our women like animals, we lose the street. The young cats will handle it themselves. They'll ambush him on his patrol, and then we've got a war. Bumpy slowly placed the Black Knight back on the board. He looked up at Illinois, his eyes cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear. A war is exactly what we cannot afford, Illinois, Bumpy said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that commanded absolute attention. You think I don't want to carve Raymond Hayes into pieces? You think I don't want to string him up from the lamppost on 125th Street for what he did to that girl? Then give the word, Illinois demanded. Give me the word, Bumpy. I'll do it myself. No, Bumpy said, standing up. He walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping city. You kill a cop, Illinois. You don't just kill a man. You attack the shield. You attack the establishment. If Hayes turns up in an alley with a bullet in his head, the nipped won't look for justice. They will look for vengeance. Bumpy turned back to face the room, his silhouette framed by the neon lights of the avenue below. They will flood Harlem with blue uniforms. They will kick down every door, smash every numbers bank, close every club, and beat every black man they see walking down the street until someone gives up a name. They will burn our neighborhood to the ground to prove a point. Killing Raymond Hayes would be easy. Surviving the fallout would be impossible. So what? Illinois threw his hands up in frustration. We just let him get away with it? We let him walk the beat tomorrow with that smug smile on his face, knowing he can do whatever he wants to whoever he wants. I didn't say we let him get away with it, Bumpy said softly, a dangerous smile playing on his lips. I said we aren't going to kill him. Bumpy walked back to the chessboard. He stared at the pieces, his mind locking onto a strategy. Killing a man makes him a martyr to his brothers in blue, Bumpy murmured, almost to himself. They hold a grand funeral. They fold a flag. They name a street corner after him. His wife gets a pension, and his memory becomes a weapon they use against us. Bumpy picked up a white pawn, a piece representing the police, and held it up to the light. But what happens, Bumpy asked, looking at Illinois, when a man simply vanishes? What happens when a decorated officer disappears in the middle of the night, leaving behind nothing but disgrace? Illinois frowned, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. What are you talking about, Bumpy? I'm talking about erasure, Illinois. I'm talking about making Officer Raymond Hayes a ghost, a man who ran away, a coward, a thief. Bumpy dropped the white pawn into his pocket. By tomorrow morning, Raymond Hayes is going to cease to exist, and the police department won't send an army to find him. They'll be too busy trying to cover up the scandal. Bumpy walked to his desk and picked up the heavy black rotary telephone. He began to dial, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Gather the crew, Illinois. Not the hotheads. I want Junie Bird. I want quiet men. Men who know how to follow orders without asking questions. And Illinois. Bumpy paused, the receiver pressed to his ear, listening to the ringing on the other end of the line. Go down to the diner on Lenox. Find a girl named Sarah. Tell her I need a favor. Tell her it pays well. But she needs to be brave. Tonight, we are going hunting, but we aren't using bullets. We are using bait. An hour and a half later, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a thick, freezing fog that rolled off the Harlem River, swallowing the docks and the abandoned warehouses of the industrial district. The streetlights struggled to penetrate the gloom, casting hazy yellow halos that barely illuminated the cracked pavement. It was a dead zone, a place where the city pushed its forgotten machinery and its darkest secrets. Parked in the shadows of a towering, rusted warehouse was a yellow taxicab. The engine was off. The lights were dead. It looked like just another abandoned vehicle dumped by a driver who had given up on his shift. But inside the back seat of the cab sat Sarah. She was young, barely 20 years old, dressed in a sharp wool coat and a small, stylish hat. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. She was terrified. She knew who she was waiting for, and she knew exactly what kind of monster he was. But Bumpy Johnson had asked her personally. Bumpy had looked her in the eye, handed her a thick roll of bills, and promised her on his life that she would not be harmed. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's word was stronger than steel. She took a deep breath, watching the fog swirl past the fogged-up windows of the cab, and waited. 3 blocks away, Officer Raymond Hayes was driving his patrol car, feeling like a king surveying his conquered territory. He was in a foul mood. The high of his assault on Lorraine Parker had faded, leaving behind a restless, itching paranoia that he masked with arrogance. He gripped the steering wheel with heavy hands, scanning the dark streets, looking for a victim, looking for an excuse to wield his power. As he turned down the street running parallel to the river, his headlights swept across the fog and caught the reflection of the yellow taxicab parked in the shadows of the warehouse. Hayes slowed the cruiser to a crawl. He squinted through the windshield. A cab parked in the industrial district at 3 a.m. meant only one of 2 things: a driver sleeping off a drunk, or a couple of kids looking for a quiet place. Either way, it was an opportunity. It was a chance to shake someone down, to assert his dominance, to feel the rush of fear radiating from a civilian. Hayes pulled the cruiser up behind the cab, leaving his headlights on to blind anyone looking out the rear window. He didn't turn on his sirens or his flashing lights. He wanted the element of surprise. He stepped out of the cruiser, the heavy door thudding shut in the quiet night. He adjusted his gun belt, relishing the weight of the heavy revolver resting on his hip. He pulled out his long wooden nightstick, slapping it rhythmically against his open palm as he walked toward the cab. "All right, party's over," Hayes muttered to himself, a cruel smile stretching across his face. He approached the passenger side door. Through the foggy glass, he could just make out the silhouette of a woman sitting alone in the back seat. Perfect, he thought, a woman alone in a stalled cab. Easy pickings. He tapped the tip of his nightstick against the glass. A sharp, aggressive crack. "Police?" Hayes barked, his voice dripping with false authority. "Roll down the window, or I break it." Inside the cab, Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She followed Bumpy's instructions perfectly. She didn't roll down the window. Instead, she reached for the door handle, unlocked it, and pushed the heavy door open just an inch. Hayes took the bait. He grabbed the handle and yanked the door wide open, leaning his massive upper body into the cab, bringing the smell of stale whiskey and wet wool with him. "What are you doing out here all by yourself, little girl?" Hayes sneered, his eyes dropping to her legs. "You know it's against the law to be loitering in a commercial zone. I might have to take you in for questioning." Sarah didn't speak. She just stared at him, her eyes wide, playing the part of the terrified victim to absolute perfection. "Cat got your tongue?" Hayes laughed, reaching out to grab her arm. "Come on out here. Let's have a chat in the cruiser." Before his fingers could graze the fabric of her coat, a sound cut through the heavy fog. It wasn't a loud sound. It was the distinct, metallic snick of a high-powered flashlight clicking on. A blinding beam of pure white light hit Officer Raymond Hayes directly in the face. Hayes cursed, stumbling backward, throwing a hand up to shield his eyes. "Who the hell is that?" he shouted, his hand instinctively dropping to the handle of his revolver. "I'm a police officer. Show yourself." "I know exactly what you are, Raymond," a voice said from the blinding light. It was a voice that didn't yell, didn't panic, and didn't shake. It was a voice that possessed the terrifying, absolute calm of a man who held all the cards. It was a voice that Raymond Hayes had heard on the radio, had heard whispered in the precinct locker rooms, but had never heard directed at him. The flashlight beam dropped slightly, illuminating the wet pavement and allowing Hayes's eyes to adjust to the shadows. Stepping out from the thick fog, immaculately dressed in his charcoal suit and fedora, a long overcoat draped over his shoulders, was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. But Bumpy was not alone. From the darkness of the warehouse loading dock to his left, the massive, silent silhouette of Junie Bird stepped forward, a heavy iron pipe resting casually against his thigh. From the right, stepping out from behind a stack of wooden pallets, came Illinois Gordon, his hand resting inside his coat, clearly gripping the handle of his own pistol. And from the shadows behind the police cruiser, cutting off any hope of retreat, 3 more men materialized, blocking the street entirely. Hayes's arrogance evaporated in a heartbeat, replaced by a cold, primal terror. He was completely surrounded. The badge on his chest, the badge that he had used as a shield and a weapon for 10 years, suddenly felt utterly useless. He wasn't in his precinct. He wasn't in a courtroom. He was in the dark, by the river, and the King of Harlem had come to collect a debt. Hayes's hand twitched toward his holster. "I wouldn't," Bumpy said softly, taking a slow, measured step forward. "Junie is very fast, Raymond, and he doesn't like you. If you touch that gun, you will never touch anything else for the rest of your natural life." Hayes froze. The sweat broke out cold and slick on the back of his neck. He looked at Junie Bird, whose eyes were dead and unblinking. He looked at Illinois Gordon, whose face was twisted in a snarl of pure hatred. And finally, he looked at Bumpy Johnson, who was watching him with the mild curiosity of a scientist observing a trapped rat. "You're making a mistake, Bumpy," Hayes said, his voice cracking, the false bravado desperately trying to hold the line. "You touch a cop, the whole city comes down on your head. You know that. You're too smart for this." "You're right, Raymond," Bumpy said, stopping just 5 feet away from the terrified officer. "I am too smart for this, which is why you are not going to die tonight." Bumpy reached into his overcoat and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He held it up in the fog, the dim light catching the edge of the paper. But the Raymond Hayes who thought he could walk into Small's paradise, take what didn't belong to him, and walk away clean? Bumpy smiled, and it was the most chilling thing Hayes had ever seen. That man died the second he opened this cab door. Your life in New York is over. The only question left is what kind of ghost you want to be. Hayes stared at the thick, yellow paper of the manila envelope. It seemed to pulse in the harsh white beam of the flashlight, a heavy physical manifestation of his impending doom. The cold wind blowing off the Harlem River whipped the edges of his heavy wool uniform coat, but the chill he felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the freezing, paralyzing realization that he was no longer the apex predator of the city streets. He was simply a man trapped in an alley of his own making, surrounded by wolves who did not care about the brass shield pinned to his chest. "A ghost," Hayes whispered, the words scraping against his throat like sandpaper. His eyes darted frantically from the impassive, terrifying bulk of Junie Bird to the barely contained rage burning in the eyes of Illinois Gordon. "You can't do this. I'm a decorated officer. You can't just make me disappear." Bumpy Johnson let out a low, smooth chuckle that carried no warmth whatsoever. He slowly lowered the envelope, tapping it thoughtfully against the palm of his leather-gloved hand. "Raymond, you still think you are operating under the rules of the city," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a judge handing down a final sentence. "You think there is a judge, a jury, a union representative who is going to step out of this fog and save you. But you left the city the moment you put your hands on Lorraine Parker. You crossed the border into my kingdom, and in my kingdom I am the judge, and Junie here, well, Junie is the executioner." At the mention of his name, Junie Bird shifted his weight. It was a microscopic movement, just the shifting of a heavy boot on the wet pavement, but the heavy iron pipe resting against his thigh made a dull metallic clink. To Hayes, the sound was louder than a gunshot. It was the sound of bones breaking. It was the sound of a shallow grave being dug in the muddy banks of the river. "I have two options for you, Raymond," Bumpy continued, stepping entirely out of the flashlight beam so that he was nothing more than a sharply tailored shadow, a voice emerging from the darkness. "Option number one is the simplest. It requires very little paperwork. Illinois here is itching to put a bullet in your kneecap. Junie is hoping to test the tensile strength of that iron pipe against your skull. We strip you of that uniform, we wrap you in heavy chains from the warehouse, and we introduce you to the bottom of the Harlem River. The currents are very strong this time of year. You won't wash up until spring, and by then, the fish will have ensured that your dental records are a matter of pure imagination." Hayes felt his knees begin to tremble. The sheer clinical detachment in Bumpy's voice stripped away any illusion that this was a bluff. Bumpy wasn't trying to scare him. Bumpy was simply laying out a business proposition. "Please," Hayes choked out, the arrogance entirely drained from his thick frame. He raised his hands, the massive, meaty palms that had battered Lorraine just hours before now shaking like leaves in a hurricane. "Please, Bumpy. I was drunk. I wasn't thinking straight. I'll stay away from her. I swear on my mother's life, I will never set foot in Small's Paradise again. I'll transfer precincts. I'll go to Staten Island. You'll never see me again." "Oh, you are absolutely right about that," Bumpy agreed, taking a slow step forward. "I will never see you again. But Staten Island is far too close. The air there is too similar to the air here." "No, Raymond, option number one is the river. Option number two requires you to open this envelope." Bumpy extended his arm. The manila envelope hung in the space between them, a bridge between life and death. Hayes didn't want to take it. Every instinct screamed at him that taking the envelope was a surrender of his soul. But the alternative was standing right beside him, holding an iron pipe and waiting for the nod. With trembling fingers, Hayes reached out and took the heavy packet. "Open it," Bumpy commanded softly. Hayes fumbled with the metal clasp. His fingers were numb from the cold and the terror. He finally managed to pry the flap open and pulled out the contents. There were 3 items inside. The first was a small rectangular piece of stiff cardboard, a train ticket. Hayes squinted in the dim light. It was a one-way ticket on the Southern Pacific Rail line, departing from Penn Station at 5 in the morning. The destination, printed in stark black ink, was a small, dusty border town deep in the heart of Mexico. The name on the passenger manifest was not Raymond Hayes. It was Robert Miller. Mexico? Hayes breathed, looking up at Bumpy in absolute disbelief. "You want me to go to Mexico?" "Robert Miller wants to go to Mexico," Bumpy corrected him smoothly. "Robert Miller is a man who is looking for a new start in a place where the sun is hot, the liquor is cheap, and the local police do not care about a man's past as long as he keeps his head down and pays his bribes. Look at the second item, Raymond." Hayes reached into the envelope again. His fingers brushed against a folded piece of heavy, official-looking stationery. He pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a letter, typed neatly, but at the bottom, bearing a signature that made the blood freeze in his veins. It was his own signature. It was a perfect, flawless forgery of his handwriting. He read the words, his lips moving silently, his eyes widening in horror as he absorbed the narrative Bumpy had constructed for him. It was a confession. But it wasn't a confession about Lorraine Parker. It was a confession to stealing thousands of dollars from the Police Benevolent Fund. It detailed a massive, sprawling embezzlement scheme, implicating himself as a degenerate gambler who had robbed the widows and orphans of his fallen brothers in blue to pay off mob debts. The letter ended with a desperate, cowardly apology to his wife Martha, stating that the shame was too much to bear and that he was leaving the city forever to avoid the disgrace of a public trial. "Where did you get this?" Hayes demanded, his voice rising in panic. "This is a lie. I never stole a dime from the fund. I'm a straight cop when it comes to the money." "You were a straight cop," Bumpy corrected gently. "But the beautiful thing about paper, Raymond, is that paper does not care about the truth. Paper only cares about what people are willing to believe. And right now, sitting inside your locked locker at the precinct, beneath your spare boots, is a duffel bag containing $10,000 in marked, sequential bills. Illinois was very busy while you were out terrorizing jazz singers." Illinois Gordon offered a thin, wicked smile from the shadows, tapping the brim of his fedora. "When you don't show up for roll call tomorrow morning," Bumpy explained, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather over a cup of coffee, "your captain is going to open your locker. He is going to find the money. And then he is going to receive a copy of that letter. You will instantly become the most hated man in the New York Police Department. You didn't just break the law, Raymond. You stole from your own brothers. You stole from the widows. They will despise you. They will spit on your name." "My wife," Hayes whispered, the reality of the destruction crashing down upon him. "Martha, she'll read this. She'll think I'm a thief, a coward." "She will," Bumpy agreed. "Which brings us to the third item in the envelope." Hayes didn't want to look. He felt physically sick. The alley behind Small's Paradise seemed like a lifetime ago. He reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out a folded stack of heavy paper and several glossy photographs. "What is this?" Hayes asked, his voice completely broken. "That," Bumpy said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all of its conversational warmth and becoming pure, unadulterated ice, "is an insurance policy. That is a sworn, notarized affidavit from Lorraine Parker, alongside photographs of her injuries taken by my personal physician not 30 minutes ago. It details exactly what you did to her tonight, and it names you, Officer Raymond Hayes, very, very clearly." Hayes stared at the paperwork as if it were a coiled venomous snake. "If you ever leave Mexico," Bumpy said, taking a step closer, his eyes locking onto Hayes's with the intensity of a predator staring down its prey. If you ever cross the border back into the United States, if you ever try to contact your wife, your friends, or your captain, if you ever so much as breathe the air of New York City again, those documents will be delivered to the front desk of the New York Times. They will be delivered to the district attorney. They will be delivered to Martha. You won't just be a thief who ran away. You will be a monster who was exposed. The police won't protect you then, Raymond. They will throw you to the wolves to save their own reputation. The silence in the fog-drenched street was absolute. The only sound was the distant, mournful blast of a tugboat horn echoing off the black water of the river. So, Bumpy said softly, "The river or the train? Choose." Hayes looked at the dark, freezing water lapping against the rusted pylons of the dock. He looked at Junie Byard's iron pipe, and then he looked at the train ticket in his hand. The choice was a nightmare either way, but the primitive, biological drive to keep breathing, no matter the cost, overpowered his pride. "The train," Hayes whispered, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. "I'll take the train." "Excellent choice, Robert," Bumpy smiled. "Now, take off the uniform." For the next 10 minutes, under the silent, watchful eyes of Bumpy's crew, Officer Raymond Hayes was systematically stripped of everything that made him a man of power. He removed the heavy wool coat with the brass buttons. He unpinned his silver shield, the symbol of his authority, and dropped it into the puddles on the pavement. He unbuckled his heavy leather gun belt, letting his service revolver clatter onto the wet asphalt. Illinois Gordon stepped forward, scooped up the weapon, and tucked it into his own waistband. From the trunk of the yellow taxicab, one of the quiet men produced a cheap, ill-fitting civilian suit. It was the color of dirty mustard, smelling faintly of mothballs and stale sweat. Hayes was forced to put it on in the freezing cold. The trousers were too short, the jacket too tight across his broad shoulders. In his police uniform, he had looked like a formidable wall of authority. In the cheap mustard suit, he looked exactly like what he was about to become. A desperate, pathetic drifter. "Get in the back of the cab," Bumpy ordered. Hayes climbed into the back seat, the vinyl cold against his trembling legs. Illinois Gordon slid in next to him, the barrel of his newly acquired police revolver pressing firmly into Hayes's ribs. Bumpy sat in the front passenger seat. Junie Byard took the wheel. The cab pulled away from the river, leaving the discarded police uniform and the silver shield lying in the mud, abandoned and forgotten in the fog. The drive to the train station was a masterclass in psychological torture. No one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the tires over the wet cobblestones and the steady, terrified breathing of the man in the back seat. Hayes stared out the window at the sleeping city. He watched the streetlights flicker past, illuminating the familiar corners and avenues he used to patrol. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that he was looking at his home for the very last time. He would never drink coffee at his favorite diner again. He would never sleep in his own bed. He would never see his wife. He was a ghost, being ferried across the river Styx in a yellow taxicab. They arrived at the station just before 4:30 in the morning. The massive, cavernous building was practically deserted, shadows stretching long and distorted across the marble floors. The air smelled of ozone, floor wax, and the metallic tang of train brakes. Bumpy, Illinois, and Junie flanked Hayes as they marched him through the grand concourse toward the boarding platforms. Hayes walked with his head down, the cheap mustard suit marking him as a transient. Every footstep echoed in the vast, empty space, sounding like the ticking of a giant clock, counting down the final seconds of his life in America. "Track 9, Bumpy said quietly, reading the massive departure board clicking above their heads. "The Southern Pacific. It's time to go, Robert." They descended the wide concrete stairs toward the dimly lit platform. The massive steel behemoth of the train sat idling on the tracks, hissing steam into the cold morning air. A single conductor stood by the open doors, checking his pocket watch, waiting for the final few passengers to board. Hayes felt a sudden, desperate urge to run, to scream for help, to grab the conductor and beg for the police. But the cold pressure of Illinois Gordon's gun against his spine reminded him that running would only result in a quiet, immediate death in the shadows of the station. They reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the boarding door. "Hold it right there." The voice echoed sharply against the tiled walls of the platform. It wasn't the conductor. It wasn't a ticket agent. Standing 30 feet away, blocking the path to the train doors, was a tall, lean man in a tan trench coat. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, but his hands were steady, and in his right hand, leveled directly at the center of Raymond Hayes's chest, was a snub-nosed .38 Detective Special. Illinois Gordon instantly raised his weapon, stepping in front of Bumpy. Junie Byard's hand dropped to his side, his muscles tensing for a sprint. Bumpy Johnson did not flinch. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply raised a hand, signaling his men to hold their fire. He recognized the man in the trench coat. It was Detective Marcus Cole. Cole was a legend in his own right, a razor-sharp investigator who operated out of the 28th Precinct. He was known as a man who played by the rules, a man of intense, quiet integrity. But looking at Cole's face in the dim light of the platform, Bumpy saw that the rules had been suspended. Cole's eyes were wide, bloodshot, and burning with a feverish, destructive intensity. "Detective Cole," Bumpy said smoothly, his voice carrying clearly over the hiss of the train engine, "you are out very early this morning. Or perhaps very late." Cole didn't look at Bumpy. His eyes were locked onto Hayes with the terrifying focus of a starving hawk. "Step aside, Bumpy," Cole said, his voice trembling with a rage that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. "This doesn't concern you. This is between me and that piece of garbage wearing the mustard suit." Hayes practically collapsed behind Illinois Gordon, using the hustler as a human shield. "Cole, Marcus, please, put the gun down. He's forcing me out of the country. He's kidnapping me." "Shut your mouth, Raymond," Cole snapped, taking a slow step forward, the barrel of the .38 not wavering an inch. "You aren't a cop anymore. You aren't anything. You are just the man who killed my sister." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Bumpy slowly lowered his hand, connecting the pieces of the puzzle in his mind. He knew about Angela Cole. The whole neighborhood knew about Angela. She had been a bright, beautiful young woman, a schoolteacher who had mysteriously thrown herself off the roof of her apartment building 6 months ago. The police ruled it a sudden tragic suicide, but the streets whispered a different story. The streets whispered that she had been relentlessly stalked, harassed, and tormented by a uniform who wouldn't take no for an answer. "Angela," Bumpy said softly, the realization dawning on him. It was Hayes. He wouldn't leave her alone, Cole said, a single tear cutting a clean line down his weary, stubble-covered face. He followed her home from the school. He waited outside her building in his cruiser. He terrified her. He broke her mind until she thought the only way to get away from him was to step off that ledge. The department covered it up. They protected the badge. But I knew. I've known for 6 months, Raymond. I've just been waiting for an excuse, waiting to catch you without your friends. Cole thumbed back the hammer of the revolver. The sharp, mechanical click echoed loudly in the cavernous station. I tracked you from the river, Bumpy, Cole said, his eyes still locked on Hayes. I saw your men strip him. I saw him get in the cab. I know you're shipping him off. But he doesn't deserve to go to Mexico. He doesn't deserve to breathe. Step aside, Bumpy. Let me do what the law won't. Illinois Gordon shifted his weight, his finger tightening on his own trigger. If Cole fired, Illinois would fire back. It would be a bloodbath on the platform of Penn Station. Marcus, listen to me, Bumpy said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a calming, hypnotic authority. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving out of the line of fire, placing himself slightly to the side of the standoff. I understand your pain. I understand your rage. If a man did to my family what this animal did to your sister, I would want to empty the cylinder into his face myself. Then get out of my way, Cole growled. But you are a smart man, Marcus, Bumpy continued, ignoring the threat, keeping his voice smooth and steady. You are a detective. You know the mechanics of a gunshot. You pull that trigger, the bullet travels at roughly 800 feet per second. It strikes Raymond in the chest. It pierces his heart. In less than 10 seconds, his brain is starved of oxygen. He feels a brief, sharp pain, and then nothing. Darkness, silence, peace. Bumpy stopped pacing and looked directly into Cole's bloodshot eyes. Is peace what you want for the man who drove your sister off a roof? Bumpy asked, his tone razor sharp. Cole hesitated. The barrel of his gun dipped a fraction of an inch. You kill him here, Marcus, and you become a murderer. Bumpy pushed, sensing the opening. They will arrest you. They will strip your badge. You will spend the rest of your life in a steel cage in Sing Sing, and Raymond Hayes will be buried in a nice cemetery with a priest saying prayers over his soul. He gets to rest. You get to suffer. Is that justice for Angela? Cole's jaw clenched. The gun began to shake in his hand. He was fighting a war inside his own mind, caught between the burning desire for immediate vengeance and the cold, terrifying logic of Bumpy's words. Look at him, Marcus, Bumpy said, pointing a gloved finger at Hayes, who was currently whimpering and cowering behind Illinois, his cheap mustard suit trembling. Look at the great Officer Hayes. He isn't a man anymore. He's a rat caught in a trap. Bumpy took another step closer to Cole, lowering his voice so that only the detective could hear the venom dripping from his words. Let him get on that train. We've already planted $10,000 in stolen police funds in his locker, along with a forged confession. Let him live with the knowledge that his wife and the rest of the city thinks he is a cowardly, thieving disgrace. Let him ride 3,000 miles to a desert where he doesn't speak the language, where he doesn't know a single soul. Let him live in a dirt floor shack with a corrugated tin roof that rattles in the wind. Let him wake up every single morning, drowning in a pool of his own sweat, terrified that every knock on the door is one of my men coming to cut his throat. A bullet is a mercy, Marcus. A bullet ends the pain. I am offering you the chance to give him a lifetime of pure, unadulterated hell. The hiss of the train engine seemed to grow louder, filling the silence that stretched between the two men. Cole stared at Bumpy. He saw the cold, calculating intelligence in the gangster's eyes. He saw the absolute certainty that Bumpy's punishment would be infinitely worse than anything a bullet could deliver. Slowly, Agonizingly, Detective Marcus Cole lowered the snub-nosed revolver. He uncocked the hammer with his thumb and slipped the weapon back into the pocket of his trench coat. He didn't say a word to Bumpy. He walked forward, his boots echoing loudly on the concrete, until he was standing just inches away from the cowering form of Raymond Hayes. Hayes squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for a punch, a kick, anything. Cole didn't hit him. He simply leaned in close, so close that Hayes could smell the stale coffee and cigarette smoke on his breath. "Angela says goodbye," Cole whispered. Then Cole hawked a massive wad of spit and fired it directly into Hayes's face. Cole turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the concourse stairway, leaving the ghost of Raymond Hayes behind. "Wipe your face, Robert," Bumpy said in disgust, looking at the broken man shivering in the mustard suit. "Your train is leaving." Illinois Gordon grabbed Hayes by the collar of his cheap jacket and shoved him roughly toward the open doors of the train car. The conductor, who had wisely decided to look the other way during the entire confrontation, quickly stepped aside. Hayes stumbled up the metal steps and fell into the dimly lit vestibule of the passenger car. He didn't turn around. He didn't look back at the city he was leaving. He simply crawled down the narrow aisle, found a seat in the back corner of the dusty car, and curled his massive frame into a tight, miserable ball. The heavy iron doors hissed shut. The whistle blew, a sharp, mournful shriek that echoed off the tiled walls of the station. With a groan of straining steel and a violent lurch, the train began to roll forward. Bumpy Johnson, Illinois Gordon, and Junie Bard stood on the platform, watching as the massive silver cars picked up speed, sliding out of the station and disappearing into the dark tunnel leading south. They had done it. They had erased a monster from the board without spilling a single drop of blood. "You think he'll try to come back?" Illinois asked quietly, lighting a cigarette and watching the red tail lights of the train vanish into the darkness. "A rat only returns to the trap if he forgets the taste of the poison," Bumpy said smoothly, adjusting the brim of his fedora. "Raymond Hayes has a very good memory. He will rot in the sun exactly as he is supposed to. Come on, Illinois. Let's go home. The night is over." The King of Harlem turned and walked back up the stairs, his shadows trailing silently behind him. 3 years later, the sun beat down on a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. It was a brutal, unforgiving heat that baked the earth hard and cracked, turning the dust into a fine powder that coated everything in a layer of miserable grit. This was the border town. It didn't really have a name, just a collection of crumbling adobe structures, rust-eaten corrugated metal shacks, and a single dirt-packed main street that smelled permanently of cheap tequila, rotting garbage, and despair. In a one-room shack at the edge of town, a man sat on the edge of a stained, sagging mattress. He was a heavy man, but the weight hung off him strangely now, like a deflated balloon. His face was unshaven, a thick, greasy beard obscuring the cruel jawline that used to command fear. His eyes, once the color of dirty ice, were now wide, bloodshot, and darting constantly toward the single, rattling wooden door of the shack. The man known as Robert Miller jumped violently as a stray dog barked outside the window. His heart hammered against his ribs. He reached under a filthy pillow and grabbed the handle of a rusty, single-action revolver he had bought from a drunken farmer for 10 pesos. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the weapon steady. He pointed it at the door, his breathing shallow and rapid, waiting for the heavy knock, waiting for the door to be kicked in. waiting for the giant, silent man with the iron pipe to step out of the blinding Mexican sun. He waited for 10 minutes. The knock never came. It never did. Hayes lowered the gun, burying his face in his hands, releasing a long, pathetic sob that was swallowed by the oppressive heat of the room. Bumpy Johnson had been right. It had been 3 years since he got on that train at Penn Station. 3 years of waking up every morning in a cold sweat. 3 years of jumping at shadows. 3 years of knowing that if he ever tried to return, if he ever tried to reclaim his life, the envelope would be opened, the documents would be released, and the world would see him for the monster he truly was. He was trapped in a prison without bars, guarded by his own paranoia and the terrifying memory of a man in a sharply tailored suit holding a manila envelope. He was alive, but he was completely, utterly dead. He reached for a half-empty bottle of cheap mezcal resting on the dirt floor, unscrewed the cap, and drank until the burning in his throat temporarily numbed the burning in his mind. He lay back on the filthy mattress, staring at the tin roof, and waited for the next shadow to terrify him. Thousands of miles away, the air was entirely different. The air was cool, electric, and vibrating with the sound of a grand, sweeping string section. It was the premier recording studio of Columbia Records, a massive, acoustically perfect room in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. Standing behind a heavy, chrome-plated microphone, wearing a stunning, pearl-colored evening gown, was Lorraine Parker. She looked radiant. The bruises from the alley had faded long ago, replaced by a fierce, untouchable strength that radiated from her every movement. She wasn't just a jazz singer in a smoky club anymore. She was a star. The pain, the terror, the absolute devastation she had experienced had not broken her. Instead, she had taken all of that darkness, all of that trauma, and she had forged it into a voice that was so pure, so incredibly powerful, that it brought grown men to tears. The producer behind the thick glass window nodded. The red recording light flashed on. Lorraine closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. It was a song about survival. It was a song about walking through the fire and coming out the other side made of gold. Her voice soared, effortlessly hitting notes that seemed to defy gravity, filling the massive studio with a warmth and a soul that was entirely her own. Sitting in the shadowy back row of the producer's booth, leaning back in a plush leather chair, sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He was perfectly still, his eyes closed, letting the incredible melody wash over him. Beside him, looking elegant and regal, in a tailored dark suit, sat his wife, Mamie. Mamie reached over in the dark and gently placed her hand over Bumpy's. "She sounds like an angel," Mamie whispered, her eyes fixed on the beautiful woman singing behind the glass. "She does," Bumpy agreed softly, opening his eyes and looking at Lorraine. He didn't see a victim. He saw a queen who had reclaimed her throne. He smiled, squeezing Mamie's hand gently. The city outside the studio was still dangerous. There would always be wolves in the alleys. There would always be men with badges who thought they were gods. But Bumpy knew that as long as he was the king of Harlem, the wolves would always have to answer to him. He leaned back in the chair, the classical notes of the string section perfectly complementing the quiet, absolute victory in his heart. The ghost of Raymond Hayes was rotting in the desert dust, while the voice of Lorraine Parker was being pressed into vinyl, immortalized forever, singing a song of beautiful, unbreakable triumph.
Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.